Mother Bear walked into the village carrying a lost baby. Everyone was in tears. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The mist hung thick over Briar Hollow, curling through the narrow paths between the village's stone cottages. The chill of early winter crept into every crack, a silent warning of the hardships yet to come. Margaret Holden, the village midwife, had seen more than 70 winters and had long learned to trust the quiet language of the land. But this morning the silence was wrong. She rose before dawn, as she always did, her bones aching with the cold, and pulled on her heavy shawl. Stepping outside, she expected to hear the usual sounds of waking life, the creak of doors, the murmurs of neighbors stoking their hearths, the distant call of an owl retreating to its nest. Instead, there was nothing. Then, through the thick fog, came a sound that did not belong. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, the crunch of frost beneath a massive weight. Margaret paused, her heart stuttering in her chest. And then she saw it. A bear. Not just any bear, but a great grizzly, its fur wet with dew, its breath misting in the cold air. It moved with purpose, slow and steady, as it padded toward the village square. But what made Margaret's breath catch in her throat was what the beast carried in its jaws. A baby. Wrapped in a torn woolen blanket, the tiny bundle swayed gently as the bear walked, held with a tenderness no wild beast should have possessed. The child whimpered, a faint, pitiful cry, and the bear paused, shifting its grip slightly to cradle the infant more securely. Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears. She should have run. She should have screamed. But she did neither. Instead, she found herself stepping forward, drawn by something she could not name. From the corner of her eye, she saw the first of the villagers stirring. Thomas Holden, her son and the village physician, stepping from his home with a tired yawn. His eyes widened in alarm as he spotted the monstrous shape in the fog. "Mother, get back!" Thomas shouted, reaching for the hunting rifle kept by the door. "No!" Margaret lifted a hand, her voice firm. "Wait!" The bear stopped at the center of the village, its massive paws sinking slightly into the frosted ground. Then, in a movement that seemed too deliberate, too human, it slowly lowered the child onto the earth. A hush fell over the village as more people gathered, drawn by the whispers and gasps. Eliza Whitmore, the town matron, clutched at her shawl, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mayor Harridan, a man who had spent his life dismissing old legends, stood frozen, mouth agape. Then, as if its mission was complete, the bear stepped back. It did not run. It did not growl. It simply sat, watching, waiting. Margaret swallowed hard. She knew what she had to do. With slow, careful steps, she approached the bundle. The air felt thick, charged with something unspoken, as if the whole world held its breath. She knelt, trembling hands reaching for the child. As she peeled back the blanket, a lump formed in her throat. The baby was frail, no more than a few weeks old, its tiny lips tinged blue from the cold. But that wasn't what made Margaret's hands shake. Around the infant's neck, tied to a delicate silver chain, hung a pendant. A symbol she had seen before, long ago in another lifetime. The crest of the Oldenborns, the exiled royal family. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This child was no orphan. This was blood of kings. Margaret's fingers tightened around the blanket. She turned her gaze to the bear, whose dark eyes gleamed with intelligence, with something ancient and knowing. "Where did you find this child?" Margaret whispered, though she knew the bear could not answer. And yet, in some unexplainable way, she felt that it did. The bear let out a low, rumbling exhale, like a sigh, and then, with the grace of a spirit fading into the mist, it rose, turned, and disappeared into the forest, leaving behind a mystery that would change the fate of Briar Hollow forever. The secrets unraveled over the days that followed. The child, whom Margaret named Edmund, grew stronger under her care. The village buzzed with speculation. Where had the bear found him? Had he been abandoned? The pendant was the only clue, but the Aldenborns had been missing for over a decade, wiped out in the war that had upended the kingdom. If this child truly bore their blood, who had left him to the mercy of the wilderness? One evening, as Margaret rocked Edmund by the fire, Thomas sat beside her, deep in thought. "Mother, do you think the bear knew that it was bringing here to safety?" Margaret traced the infant's soft cheek with a wrinkled hand. "Some creatures understand more than we do, Thomas." Her voice was quiet but certain. Perhaps the bear was not the only one who led him here. Perhaps something greater was at work. Outside in the distance, a faint, low huff echoed through the trees. A sound neither warning nor threat, but a farewell. The bear had done its part. Now the child's fate rested in human hands. And so, in the quiet safety of Briar Hollow, under the watchful eyes of those who had chosen to protect him, the last heir of Aldenborn slept peacefully for the first time. This extraordinary tale of a bear's impossible act of mercy left Briar Hollow forever changed. Some called it fate, others a miracle, but one truth remained undeniable. The bond between man and nature runs deeper than we may ever understand. And sometimes, in the most unexpected of moments, hope arrives on the back of the wild. The night the bear brought the child, the village of Briar Hollow had always been a place of quiet existence, where the seasons dictated the rhythm of life and the mountains stood as timeless sentinels against the world beyond. But on this particular morning, everything changed. Margaret Holden, the village midwife, had lived through 70 winters and had long learned to listen to the whispers of the wind and the unspoken warnings of the earth. That morning, something was different. The silence was wrong. Not the peaceful stillness of dawn, but something unnatural. She had just stepped outside her small cottage, her breath curling in the frosty air, when the first sound broke through the quiet, a heavy, deliberate footstep. Then another, too heavy for a man. She turned toward the village square and froze. Emerging from the thinning mist was a grizzly bear, its fur damp from the morning dew, its breath misting in the cold air. The beast was massive, its sheer presence enough to send ice crawling through Margaret's veins. But it wasn't the size of the bear that made her heart pound in her chest. It was what the creature carried in its jaws. A baby. Wrapped in a fine woolen blanket, barely larger than a bundle of kindling, the infant stirred weakly, its tiny hand pushing free from the fabric. The bear held it gently, impossibly so, as if it understood the fragility of its cargo. Margaret's breath caught. This was not possible. "Mother, get back!" The urgent whisper came from behind her. Thomas Holden, her son, the village physician. He had stepped outside his home, his gaze locked on the impossible sight before them. The bear walked slowly, deliberately, until it reached the very center of the village. Then, in a movement so controlled and deliberate, it defied every instinct Margaret knew about wild animals, it lowered the child onto the frozen earth. And then it sat back, watching, waiting. More villagers began to gather, whispers rippling through the crowd like dry leaves in the wind. Eliza Whitmore, the town matron, Mayor Harridan, a man who had spent his life dismissing old superstitions, looked pale and shaken. And then Margaret saw it. The bear's eyes were wet, tears. She wasn't the only one who noticed. "The bear is weeping," someone whispered. The child let out a feeble cry. Margaret's instincts overpowered her hesitation. She took a step forward. The bear did not move. She knelt by the bundle, her fingers trembling as she pulled back the blanket. The baby was tiny, no more than a few weeks old, its lips tinged blue from the cold. And around its neck, on a delicate silver chain, hung a pendant. Margaret stared at it. An intricate crest, familiar yet impossible. The royal sigil of Oldenburg. A sharp gasp from Thomas confirmed her worst fear. "Mother, this child!" Margaret turned to the bear, her hands gripping the edges of the blanket. "Where did you find this baby?" she whispered. And then something happened that defied everything. The bear let out a low, rumbling exhale, like a sigh of relief and sorrow. Then, suddenly, its ears twitched. A distant sound carried on the wind. Voices, angry, searching, accompanied by the baying of hounds. Margaret's blood ran cold. The bear's entire body tensed, its eyes flicking toward the tree line. And then, in a movement far too graceful for a beast of its size, it turned and disappeared into the forest. It was gone. But danger was coming. If you're still watching this story, drop a "own" in the comments to let us know you're here. The baby squirmed in Margaret's arms as she stood. A slip of parchment fluttered from the folds of the blanket, falling onto the frozen ground. Thomas bent and picked it up, his face pale as he read. "To whoever finds my child, they murdered the king, and they are coming for her next. Please, keep her safe. She is all that remains of our bloodline." The air around them seemed to still. "The king is dead," Mayor Harridan whispered. Thomas turned to Margaret, his voice barely audible. "Mother, this baby is the lost princess of Oldenburn." The ground seemed to shift beneath Margaret's feet. Behind them, the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Too close, Margaret acted on instinct. Inside, now. She turned toward her cottage, gripping the baby tightly as Thomas followed, already scanning the parchment for more clues. Who had sent this message? Who had trusted a child to a bear? Inside, the warm air from the dying fire wrapped around them. Thomas grabbed the blanket stitched into its lining, feeling something hidden within the fabric. With careful hands he tore the seam and pulled free a map. Margaret's heart pounded as she studied it. The markings were clear. An old legend whispered by the elders. A place where the guardian bears of Oldenburn were said to live. Was it real? Or had a desperate mother put her faith in myth? Outside, the thunder of hooves echoed through the streets. Thomas moved quickly, pulling open the false panel beneath the hearth, a long-forgotten smuggler's tunnel leading deep into the hills. Margaret hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. As she held the tiny princess close, she whispered, "You are safe, little one. You will live." And as the secret panel slid shut behind them, the child of a fallen king disappeared into the shadows, while the hunters, unaware of the miracle that had saved her, searched in vain. And somewhere deep within the wild, the bear watched, waiting, for its mission was not yet complete. The bear's secret and the path to the Western Temple. The damp chill of the tunnel clung to Margaret's skin as she pressed forward, the weight of the child against her chest, both grounding and terrifying. The glow of the crystal in her palm flickered like a restless flame, casting shifting shadows against the slick stone walls. Behind her, the muffled clatter of boots and the angry voices of the search party seeped through the cracks in the old wooden floor above. They were searching. They were close. And then, Maven's voice rang out, firm as iron beneath the morning fog. "Search all you want, Lord Darius." Margaret froze, pressing herself against the tunnel wall, listening. "Our village woke to nothing but mist this morning." There was a pause, tense, waiting, before a cold voice replied, dripping with barely contained violence. "The bear's tracks led directly here, old woman. Unlike you, bears don't lie." Margaret's breath caught. The soldiers had followed the bear's path, but Maven was buying them time. But they do choose interesting paths, don't they? The old woman countered, her voice carrying a quiet amusement that made Margaret's spine tingle. "The tracks you followed. They circled the entire village before leading back into the deep woods. almost as if the creature wanted you to waste your time here while something more important happened elsewhere. Margaret's heart pounded. Had Maven used magic to alter the tracks? Or had she simply seen something others missed? Either way, the search party was being led astray. But not for long. She needed to move. Ancient secrets in the stone. Margaret adjusted Aurora's small body against her chest. The child's faint warmth, a reminder of why she could not fail. The tunnel twisted sharply, forcing Margaret to press a hand against the damp wall for balance. Something rough met her fingers. Carvings, old, ancient. Margaret lifted the glowing crystal closer, and the light revealed a sight that stole her breath. Bears, standing upright, adorned in crowns and robes. Between them, humans knelt, their hands raised in gestures of supplication or blessing. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran through her. The old stories, the tales whispered by firelight, dismissed as myth. Her voice came as a hush against the damp air. They say that before the human kingdoms, the bears ruled these lands, that they taught our ancestors how to build, how to heal, how to speak with the earth itself. Aurora stirred, tiny fingers curling around the fabric of Margaret's cloak, as if sensing the weight of the past. Margaret forced herself forward. Ahead, the tunnel began to widen, the air shifting, less damp, more open, the exit. She broke into a run, feet splashing against shallow puddles as she emerged into the forest. But something was wrong. The gathering of the Guardians, the forest was alive. Margaret had grown up near the deep woods, but never had she heard it like this. The trees groaned, their trunks whispering secrets to the wind. The leaves rustled, though there was no breeze, and beneath it all, a sound deep, resonant, vibrating through the ground itself. A rumble. She turned, heart hammering. At first, she thought it was the wind shifting the mist, but then she saw them. Eyes, golden, watchful, emerging from the mist like phantoms. Bears, not one, not two, dozens. Their massive forms blended with the silver fog, their dark fur catching only faint hints of moonlight, silent, waiting. Then, a shift. From the heart of their gathering, one stepped forward. Margaret's breath caught. This was not just a bear. Its fur was streaked with silver. Its eyes glowed with something beyond intelligence. Something ancient, something knowing. And around its massive neck, a pendant identical to the one Aurora wore gleamed in the dim light. This was no ordinary beast. This was a guardian. Margaret did not move. The guardian took another step closer, then lowered its head, not in aggression, but in something that looked almost like acknowledgement. And then it spoke, not in words, but in a voice that bypassed the ears entirely, resonating directly in the bones of her chest. "You have brought her home." Margaret's knees nearly gave out. This was impossible. Yet some part of her had always known. The stories were not myths. The Guardians were real. Aurora was meant to be here. A gust of wind stirred the trees, and in the distance, the faint call of a hunting horn broke the silence. The search party was still on their trail. Margaret clutched the baby tighter, a wave of instinctual protectiveness surging through her. She had risked everything to get here, and now she had one final choice: to turn back, to run, to hide, to keep the child from the world that had forsaken her, or to step forward, into the unknown, into the embrace of legends, into destiny itself. The Guardian's eyes burned into hers. Margaret swallowed, and then she stepped forward. Aurora did not cry. And as Margaret crossed the threshold of the sacred grove, the fog closed behind her, sealing the world they had left behind. The princess was safe, and the story of the guardian bears of Aldenborn was about to begin again. If you're still watching this story, Drop a roan in the comments to let us know you're here. Some believe that the world of legends is long gone, that magic fades and only memory remains. But sometimes, a child is placed into the jaws of a bear. Sometimes, a healer becomes a protector, and a protector becomes part of a greater story. And sometimes, in the deepest woods, under the watchful eyes of something ancient and unseen, a kingdom's fate is rewritten by those brave enough to listen to the whispers of the wild. The path of the chosen Margaret Holden pressed forward, her heartbeat thrumming in her ears. The tunnel walls whispered with long-forgotten voices, illuminated by the silver glow pulsing from the pendant around Aurora's tiny neck. The further they walked, the brighter the ancient symbols became, as if sensing the presence of the child. The last of Alder's royal bloodline. Behind her, the voice of Thaddeus Ironpaw, the guardian bear, lingered in her thoughts. Trust in what your blood tells you is true. Margaret's mind reeled with the revelations. The legends were real. Alder's royal bloodline carried more than just a title. It carried the mingling of bear and human, an ancient alliance forged in an era long forgotten. But a betrayal had shattered it, driving the guardian bears into the deep woods, leaving only a few behind to watch from the shadows. Now, that ancient blood had awakened again, in Aurora. Margaret tightened her grip on the child as she descended deeper into the earth, following a path she had never seen before, but somehow felt she had always known. Above them, the search party was still moving, their voices growing distant, but Margaret knew better than to feel safe. Darius was relentless. The man who had murdered his own family to seize the throne would not let his newborn niece slip away so easily, if he had sensed, even unknowingly, the ancient power buried in her blood. He would never stop hunting her. Margaret's fingers trembled as she adjusted the baby's blanket, feeling the fine royal fabric beneath her touch. The pendant glow flickered against Aurora's delicate features, and for the first time, Margaret truly looked at the infant's eyes. Amber, deep, knowing, the same color as Thaddeus, as Lyanna, the guardian bear who had carried her here. A chill crept down Margaret's spine. Had the child always had these eyes? Or had something awakened inside her? Aurora cooed softly, her tiny fingers reaching for Margaret's face. A warmth spread through her, an unspoken reassurance. The baby was not afraid, and neither should she be. Margaret exhaled and pressed forward. The tunnel of echoes, the further they walked, the more the symbols on the walls came alive. At first, they were simple carvings, but now they moved. The stone pulsed with memories shifting like reflections on water. Margaret slowed, watching in awe as a vision unfolded before her. A great hall, its wooden beams carved with bear motifs, stood filled with humans and bears alike, feasting together, sharing knowledge, speaking in a language Margaret could almost understand. Children played with bear cubs, weaving flowers into their thick fur. In another vision, a human queen, Aurora's ancestor, perhaps, stood beside a bear the size of a war horse, both of them lifting their hands and paws in a blessing over their gathered subjects. Margaret's breath caught. This was the truth. Not the fairy tales twisted into fearsome warnings, not the stories of cursed beasts lurking in the shadows. There was a time when bears and humans were equals, guardians of the same land, and then something shattered it. The visions darkened, shifting to fire and war. A blade raised against a bear's throat, a kingdom torn apart. Then the visions faded. Margaret's fingers tingled as she touched the wall, half expecting the stone to still be warm from the memories it had just revealed. Behind her, Aurora let out a small sound, her eyes still glowing faintly. She had seen it too. The crossroads, a gust of damp air rushed through the tunnel, carrying the scent of pine and fresh earth. Margaret knew they were close to the exit. Ahead, the tunnel split in two. She hesitated, glancing between the paths. To the left, the abandoned temple, the one the soldiers would expect her to flee toward. To the right, the path to the deep woods, hidden to all but those who carried the ancient bloodline. Thaddeus' words echoed in her mind. The sacred grove lies 3 days' journey through the deep woods, but the path is known only to those who carry the old blood. Margaret clenched her jaw. There was no hesitation in her heart. She turned right. The guardians await. The tunnel began to rise, the scent of the forest growing stronger. Margaret quickened her pace, nearly running as the first hints of daylight filtered through the craggy stone walls ahead. Then, a deep rumble. Not thunder. Not a storm. A growl. Margaret froze, clutching Aurora tightly. From the shadows at the tunnel's mouth, something massive stirred. A pair of glowing amber eyes locked onto hers, filled with unreadable depth. Then, another. And another. Margaret gasped as 3 enormous bears stepped forward, their silver-streaked fur gleaming in the dawnlight. Guardians. The largest of them, wearing intricately worked leather armor, stepped closer. Margaret's pulse pounded. Would they see her as an intruder? A thief of their legacy? But Aurora stirred, and as if sensing her presence, the bears bowed their heads. Margaret let out a shaky breath. She had made the right choice. A gust of wind rippled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of hunting horns. Darius and men were still searching, but they were too late. Margaret stepped forward, into the clearing, into the unknown. The guardian bears closed ranks behind her, sealing the entrance to the sacred path. There was no turning back now. She had chosen her path, and the fate of a kingdom would be decided by the steps she took next. Some secrets must be protected far away. In the village Margaret had left behind, Maven Blackwood stood at the edge of the forest, watching the soldiers depart with empty hands and furious curses. She exhaled slowly, a knowing smile touching her lips. The girl had made it. Maven's fingers traced the symbol hidden beneath the collar of her cloak, the sigil of the Sisterhood of the Silver Dawn, a secret order sworn to protect the knowledge of the old ways. Thaddeus had been right. The bears were not the only ones who had chosen to guard their secrets, and now Margaret Holden would carry them forward. The last guardian of Alder's forgotten past. The blood of 2 realms, Margaret Holden pressed forward, cradling Aurora close as the tunnel pulsed with an ancient rhythm. The words carved into the glowing walls echoed in her mind. Here begins the true history of 2 realms. Thaddeus Ironpaw padded beside her, his massive form barely making a sound. His amber eyes flickered with a knowing light, as if he had walked this path 1,000 times before. The tunnel changed as they descended deeper. The rough stone gave way to smooth, polished walls inlaid with veins of silver that pulsed with their own light. The air grew warmer, carrying an impossible scent of earth and blooming things, as though the very forest above had seeped into this underground sanctuary. Aurora stirred, her amber eyes widening as she reached for the glowing symbols. The child's pendant flared with silver light, casting dancing reflections onto the walls. Margaret swallowed hard. She had never believed in legends. Not the guardian bears who once protected Alder. Not the stories of humans and bears who had once ruled together. Yet here she was, deep beneath the earth, walking beside a talking bear, carrying a child whose very existence threatened the ambitions of a king. And she was no longer certain that she had ever truly known herself. A forgotten past. The bears were not always as you see us now, Thaddeus spoke into her mind, his voice deep as the earth itself. Margaret shuddered, but not from fear. The words settled into her bones, awakening something long buried. In the time before the Sundering, we walked in many forms. Some remained as bears, finding wisdom in the connection to earth and forest. Others took human form, weaving themselves into noble houses. And some, his amber eyes gleamed. Some learned to walk between forms, carrying both bloodlines in perfect balance. Margaret's breath caught. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber. Huge crystals jutted from the walls and ceiling, filled with what looked like moving scenes frozen in time. Margaret gasped. In one, bears shimmered and shifted into humans, their eyes glowing with silver light. In another, a human queen stood before an ancient tree, her form rippling into that of a bear, her arms raised toward the sky. She turned to Thaddeus in shock. This isn't possible." The great bear regarded her solemnly. "Your Maven was one such walker between." Margaret nearly stumbled. Maven? The woman who had raised her? "The village elder?" Thaddeus continued. "She was born to the Sisterhood of the Silver Dawn, daughters of both bear and human blood. They dedicated their lives to preserving the old ways. But when the great betrayal came, when Lord Darius' ancestors tried to erase their lineage, the Sisterhood went into hiding." Margaret's stomach twisted. Maven had known. She had known what Aurora was the moment she had arrived, and she had known what Margaret was too. The betrayal, a sudden sound, echoed through the chamber, warped and distorted. Margaret stiffened. Voices. Darius's men were near. Thaddeus growled. "They are using tracking hounds," he rumbled. "But they'll find only confusion. The Sisterhood's magic still lingers in these tunnels." As if in response, the silver veins in the walls pulsed brighter. Margaret felt something stir in her blood, an answering power. "Let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you're new to our channel." Aurora's pendant flared, and suddenly, the chamber was full of ghostly figures. Margaret gasped. She saw men and women of royal and common blood, bears of all sizes, living together in this very place. They had once thrived here. She saw a woman who looked startlingly like Maven, teaching a group of children, some with amber eyes like Aurora's, how to shift between forms. Then, fire. Margaret flinched as the images turned dark. The betrayal. The bloodlines that had denied their bear nature lost their ability to shift. Those who remained as bears forgot their human past, and the few who carried both natures, like Margaret and Aurora, became scattered remnants of an ancient legacy. Thaddeus spoke. "The blood remembers even when history forgets." The choice the tunnel sloped upward, toward what felt like an exit. Margaret quickened her pace, but then she stopped. Ahead, the tunnel split in two. To the left, the abandoned temple, where Darius's men would expect them to flee. To the right, a path hidden even from the king's hunters. Margaret hesitated. Thaddeus rumbled beside her. "You must decide, young healer. The left path will lead to the temple, where Darius's men will eventually search. The right path will take you into the deep woods. The sacred grove lies 3 days beyond." Margaret clenched her jaw. There was no hesitation in her heart. She turned right. The guardians await a rush of fresh air met them as the tunnel ended. Margaret stepped into the clearing, blinking in the pale light of dawn. A low growl rumbled through the trees. Margaret froze. They were not alone. From the shadows, 3 enormous bears stepped forward, their fur silver-streaked and gleaming in the dim light. Guardians. The largest among them wore intricately worked leather armor, the symbols of the Sisterhood etched into its surface. Margaret's breath caught. Would they see her as a threat? But Aurora stirred. The pendant flared. The guardians lowered their heads. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had made the right choice. Behind them, a distant horn sounded in the valley below. Darius was still searching, but he was too late. Margaret took a step forward, into the forest, into the unknown. The guardian bears closed ranks behind her, sealing the entrance to the sacred path. There was no turning back now. She had chosen her path, and the fate of 2 realms now rested in her hands. Some secrets must be protected far behind them. In the village Margaret had left behind, Maven Blackwood watched the soldiers depart with empty hands and frustrated curses. She exhaled slowly, a knowing smile touching her lips. The girl had made it. Maven traced the hidden symbol beneath her cloak, the sigil of the Sisterhood of the Silver Dawn. Thaddeus had been right. The bears were not the only ones who had chosen to guard their secrets. And now, Margaret Holden would carry them forward, the last guardian of Alder's forgotten past. The lost heritage Margaret Holden barely heard the last of Queen Lyra's words. Her heart was pounding, her breath shallow. Her mind reeled as the truth unraveled before her, like a tapestry of history being rewoven right before her eyes. The blood of the bears flowed within her own veins. The realization sent a shudder through her. She was not just a healer's daughter. She was something more, Aurora whimpered, clutching at the glowing pendant, and Margaret instinctively held her closer. The warmth of the pendant spread through them both, like the pulse of something ancient waking within them. The spectral form of Queen Lyra hovered above the shimmering pool, watching her daughter with an expression of longing, love, and regret. Margaret swallowed hard, her voice a whisper. They erased everything. They hunted those who could shift. They murdered their own kin to hide the truth. Thaddeus let out a low, rumbling growl. Yes, fear led them to war against their own blood. His eyes flickered with sorrow. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The ability to shift was lost to all but a handful of hidden bloodlines. The guardian bears retreated, watching in silence. The Sisterhood of the Silver Dawn was all that remained to keep the old ways alive. Margaret's stomach twisted. And now, Darius hunts Aurora, because he feels the truth but does not understand it. He wants to erase the last living heir to the throne, to destroy what remains of the bloodline. Queen Lyra's spirit bowed her head. My brother feared what he could never possess, but I feared something far worse. Margaret's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Lyra's form flickered, as if struggling against the weight of time itself. The pendant does not just awaken what was lost. It is a beacon, if Darius succeeds in taking it. Her voice faltered, her sorrow palpable. He will use it to corrupt what is left of our bond with the earth. He seeks to control the magic. Margaret's blood turned to ice. If Darius got his hands on the pendant, if he twisted the old ways to suit his own power-hungry desires, it would mean the end of both the human and bear realm. A shadow passed over Lyra's face, her gaze turning toward the tunnel entrance. He is coming. The hunt begins. A distant, ominous sound shook the cavern walls, a horn, deep and foreboding. It was followed by the sharp bark of hounds and the clatter of armored boots against stone. The enemy was near. Margaret spun toward Thaddeus. We need to move. Now. The guardian bear nodded once. The path to the Grove of Awakening lies ahead, but only those of the old blood can open the way. His massive paw gestured toward the tunnel beyond the pool. The bears sealed it long ago. You must call to it. Margaret felt her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She turned to the ancient stone archway, tracing the glowing symbols carved into its surface. They looked like words, but she could not read them. Not yet. The hounds howled again. Closer. Margaret took a deep breath. The blood remembers, even when history forgets. She reached deep within herself, past logic, past fear, past everything she had been told was impossible, and let instinct take over. She placed her hand against the stone. By the blood of the two realms, I call upon the path to open. Nothing. She clenched her jaw. Footsteps. Metal scraping against stone. Darius and men were nearly upon them. Aurora whimpered, pressing her small hand against Margaret's. And suddenly, light erupted from the stone. The symbols flared, pulsing like the heartbeat of the earth itself. A low, grinding sound filled the chamber as the archway split apart, revealing a hidden path descending into darkness. Thaddeus let out a low growl of approval. "You are ready." Margaret didn't hesitate. She pulled Aurora close and ran. A price paid in blood behind them. The chamber shook as Darius' forces reached the entrance. "Find them!" A voice roared. Margaret ran faster. The tunnel twisted and turned, the air growing thick with the scent of ancient earth. A headlight, silver like the glow of the pendant, beckoned her forward. She pushed harder, her legs burning, her arms tightening around Aurora. Then a scream! Margaret skidded to a halt. "Maven!" She turned toward the sound, toward the tunnel's branching path leading to the surface. The village. Darius had caught her. The old woman's voice rang out in defiance, but it was cut off by a sickening thud. Margaret's breath hitched. No, not like this. Aurora let out a sharp cry, as if she could feel the loss through the bond they all shared. Thaddeus' voice was grave. She knew the cost. She gave you time. Margaret felt rage rise inside her, raw and searing. The urge to turn back, to fight, was overwhelming. But then she looked at Aurora. She was the last hope. With a silent prayer for Maven, Margaret forced herself forward. The Grove of Awakening at last. The tunnel ended. Margaret stumbled into a clearing bathed in moonlight. Towering trees, their silver leaves glowing softly, stood in a perfect circle. The Grove of Awakening. And waiting for them, bears. Not just any bears. Their eyes glowed like fire, their fur marked with the same silver sigils she had seen in the tunnels. The guardians of the old blood. Thaddeus stepped forward, bowing his great head. "I have returned with the heir of Alder, and the one who carries the lost gift." A massive bear, its fur white as the moon, stepped forward. Its amber eyes locked onto Margaret's. "You have come to awaken what was lost." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Yes," she whispered. "I am ready." The bear lowered its head to Aurora, gently brushing the pendant with its nose. The air shimmered. A pulse of magic rippled outward. And in that moment, Margaret felt everything change. She could feel the heartbeat of the earth beneath her feet. The whispers of the trees, the steady, powerful presence of the bears surrounding her. And in Aurora's eyes, the golden fire of a lost kingdom reignited. The awakening had begun. Far away, in the shadows of the kingdom, Lord Darius stood over Maven's fallen form, gripping the bloody hilt of his sword. But even as her lifeblood stained the frozen earth, the old woman smiled. "You are too late," she whispered. Darius narrowed his eyes. "What are you hiding, old witch?" Maven let out a breathless laugh. "History," she murmured. "And you can't kill what's already waking." The last gift of the sisterhood, the earth trembled beneath Margaret Holden's feet as Maven's final song echoed through the tunnels, the weight of her sacrifice pressing down like a storm about to break. Aurora's cry rose in the air, filled with something more than fear. A call, a response to the power unraveling around them. Margaret clutched the child tighter, her new senses reeling. She could hear it, the very stones weeping, mourning the life that had burned itself away to protect them. Thaddeus exhaled heavily beside her, his massive form bracing against the tunnel walls as they absorbed the shock of Maven's final spell. "She has given us what time she could. We must not waste it." Margaret nodded, though her heart ached. She had known Maven her entire life, but she had never truly understood the depths of the old woman's power, or the price she was willing to pay to see their mission succeed. She forced herself to move. The roots and stones ahead twisted unnaturally, pulsing with the aftershocks of Maven's magic. The hidden tunnel leading to the Grove of Awakening still glowed faintly with Aurora's pendant light, but Margaret could feel it beginning to fade. They had to hurry. She adjusted the sling, holding Aurora close, ignoring the new weight in her limbs, the subtle shift in her form that had begun since she first stepped into this passage. She was changing. She was becoming the path of the first blood. The tunnel walls narrowed again, forcing them to move single file. Thaddeus led the way, his fur brushing against the twisting roots, his breath deep and steady. Margaret followed, every step lighter, her body adjusting to the rhythm of the forest. Her senses stretched further. She could feel the life around her, pulsing in the roots beneath her hands, hear the distant heartbeats of unseen creatures curled deep within the stone. The old stories whispered that the first bloodlings had been able to hear the forest's voice. Margaret could hear it now. The trees called to her, not in words but in emotion. A pull, a guidance, a plea for protection. Aurora stirred against her, her tiny hands gripping the pendant tightly, as if she, too, could feel the growing power in the air. Then, up ahead, light, not the glow of the pendant, nor the eerie luminescence of the tunnel fungi, but true light, the end of the passage, the grove of awakening, the sacred ground. Margaret stepped into the clearing, her breath catching at the sight before her. The grove was unlike anything she had ever seen. Silver-barked trees stretched high into the sky, their leaves shimmering like molten gold in the dim light. A massive stone altar sat at the center, carved with markings she now realized she could read. Thaddeus let out a deep, rumbling sigh. "We have arrived." But before Margaret could respond, Aurora let out another cry, and the grove came alive. The ground shifted, symbols flaring to life beneath their feet. A rush of power surged through the air, like a door being unlocked after centuries of waiting. Aurora's pendant blazed like a captured star. Margaret felt something stir inside her, a memory long buried, not her own, but something older, something ancient. The knowledge of what she had to do came to her in a rush. She stepped forward, towards the altar, towards the very heart of the grove. Thaddeus remained still, watching. He would not interfere. This was her path to walk. Margaret placed Aurora gently onto the stone altar, kneeling beside her as the baby's eyes gleamed with golden fire. She took a breath, and then she let go. She let the power in her blood awaken. Let it rise like a tide breaking free. The pain was brief, a sharp pulse running through her bones, her muscles, her skin. Then she felt everything. The earth beneath her was no longer stone. It was a pulse, a heartbeat, a voice. The trees were no longer trees. They were elders, watchers, guardians. And Aurora. Aurora was the key. The pendant flared one final time, and then Margaret was not alone. The gathering of the ancestors' figures appeared around the grove, spirits of the past, of those who had once walked between worlds. Some were human, some were bear, some were both. Margaret recognized Queen Lyra among them, her presence radiating love and sorrow. The Spirit Queen placed a translucent hand over her daughter's chest. "She is ready," Lyra whispered. "But are you?" Margaret did not hesitate. "Yes," the grove responded. Wind surged through the trees, the very ground trembling as the energy of generations rushed through Margaret's blood. For a moment, she felt herself slipping, falling through time, through history, and then she stood taller, no longer half-formed, no longer caught between worlds. She was whole. The last walker between worlds. Margaret lifted Aurora from the altar, cradling the child close. The baby's golden eyes shone with understanding far beyond her years. The war for the kingdom had begun. But now, for the first time, Margaret understood. They would not fight it alone. The guardians had awakened. The walker had returned. And the world would never be the same again. In the ruins of the village, Lord Darius staggered back, gripping the stone pillar for support as a shockwave rippled through the land. Something had changed. Something far beyond his understanding had awakened. He turned to his men, his voice sharp. "Find them. Now." But even as his soldiers scrambled to obey, Darius knew. It was too late. The legacy he had tried to erase had returned, and its power was far greater than anything he could destroy. The path of the unknown. Margaret Holden's heart pounded as the two choices stretched before her. The remnants of Maven's magic leading them to the grove, or the unfamiliar song of the green singers calling them towards something older, wilder. The tunnels trembled with Lord Darius' corrupted magic, his unnatural voice twisting the language of the ancients into something brittle and broken. The air crackled with wrongness, the very earth seeming to recoil from his presence. They had only moments before he tore through Maven's last defenses. Aurora's tiny hand gripped the pendant tighter, her amber eyes gleaming with something Margaret now understood wasn't just instinct, it was knowledge. Ancient, instinctual knowledge buried deep within her blood. The choice was no longer Margaret's alone. The grove was waiting, but the green singers had been waiting far longer. She turned toward the third tunnel, its entrance pulsing with emerald light. We take the unknown path, she said. Thaddeus hesitated for only a breath before nodding. Then tread carefully, young one. The green singers do not give their gifts freely. Margaret didn't answer. She didn't have to. She could feel the song now, weaving around her bones, whispering against her skin. It wasn't calling her to follow. It was calling her to remember. She stepped forward into the green-lit passage. A realm between worlds. The air in this tunnel was different. It was thick with life, breathing, shifting, watching. Margaret's footsteps barely made a sound on the moss-covered ground. The stone walls had given way to something stranger. Not quite wood, not quite earth, but something in between, pulsing with unseen energy. Aurora whimpered softly, but not in fear. In recognition, Thaddeus moved behind them, slower than before. The great bear lowered his head in deference, not to Margaret, but to the tunnel itself. They know we are here, he rumbled. Ahead, the tunnel twisted into an archway of woven roots and glowing leaves, leading to a space that defied reason. The ceiling stretched high, filled with glowing vines that swayed without wind. At the center of the chamber stood a tree unlike any Margaret had ever seen. Its bark shimmered between green and gold, and its branches held orbs of liquid light, each one pulsing like a heartbeat. The air hummed with an old, forgotten song. Then they appeared. Figures stepped from the trees, if they could be called figures at all. They were neither entirely human nor entirely beast. Their limbs shifted between forms, their eyes gleaming with the deep, endless wisdom of the forest. They were the green singers. One of them, a tall, slender figure with skin like dappled sunlight, stepped forward, tilting its head at Margaret, as if seeing something beyond flesh and bone. "You are late, Walker Between." The voice did not come from its mouth, but rather from the air itself. The words wrapped around Margaret's thoughts, as if they had always been there, waiting for her to hear them. She swallowed hard. "You were expecting us?" A second figure emerged, this one with golden eyes that glowed like Aurora's pendant. "We have been waiting for many lifetimes," it said. "The balance was broken long ago. You carry the key to mend it." Margaret felt the weight of those words settle into her chest. What must I do?" The first green singer raised a hand, a limb that flickered between clawed fingers and leafy vines. It pointed toward the great tree. "Place the child before the heartwood," it instructed. "Let the old magic see her. Let it decide if she is worthy." Margaret's breath hitched. "And if she isn't?" The green singer's expression did not change. "Then the bloodline ends here. Then the bloodline ends here." Thaddeus let out a low growl, his stance shifting as if preparing for a fight. "She is the last of the royal line." The green singer turned its gaze to him. "There is no royal blood here, only old blood." Margaret's hands tightened around Aurora. This was no simple ritual. This was a test. She had brought Aurora this far, but would the forest accept her? The pendant around Aurora's neck flared brighter, pulsing in time with the orbs on the heartwood tree. Margaret's body tensed, but she stepped forward. She had come too far to turn back now. She knelt before the tree and carefully placed Aurora on the soft, moss-covered roots. The baby cooed, her tiny fingers reaching toward the golden orbs above. The entire chamber went silent. Then, the tree's light surged. Roots rose from the ground, wrapping gently around Aurora's small body. The air vibrated, thick with something Margaret couldn't name. Aurora giggled. The green singers inhaled sharply. Then one of them, an elder, their form shifting like a river between bear and human and something else entirely, spoke. "The bond is whole. The child is claimed." The words rang through the chamber, final and undeniable. Aurora's pendant shattered into light, dissolving into her skin. Her eyes blazed like twin suns, ancient and knowing. Margaret barely had time to react before she felt it too. Something unlocked within her, a part of herself that had always been there, but had been waiting for this moment. She wasn't just a healer. She wasn't just Aurora's protector. She was a walker between. And the forest had just awakened. Meanwhile, Lord Darius staggered as a shockwave rippled through the ground. He had been seconds away from breaking through Maven's last defenses when something far older and stronger tore through the fabric of the earth itself. His soldiers shouted in confusion as the magic recoiled from them, rejecting their presence. Darius clenched his fists. "Find them!" he snarled. "Now." But even as his men rushed forward, he knew something had changed. Something far beyond his control had awoken. And for the first time in his life, Lord Darius felt fear. The awakening of the old song. Margaret Holden felt the weight of the green singer's words settle deep into her bones. The power within her, within Aurora, was not something new. It was something old, something forgotten, waiting to be reclaimed. The chamber shimmered, reality shifting between what once was and what could be. Seasons overlapped, time folding upon itself. The green singers stood in their ever-changing forms, neither fully flesh nor fully spirit, singing a song that had once been sung by all things that lived and breathed. Behind them, the corrupted echoes of Lord Darius's magic still clawed at the edges of this sacred place. But here, in the heart of the forest's memory, his influence was muffled. One of the singers stepped closer, its form shifting between light and leaves, fur and bone. "You have come far, Bloodwalker," it sang, tilting its head at Margaret. "But your journey is not yet complete. You have remembered how to shift between forms. Now you must remember why." The green singer turned to Aurora, whose tiny fingers still clutched the air, her pendant glowing in pulses that matched the rhythm of the song around. Margaret swallowed hard. She knew the truth now. Aurora was more than the last heir of Alder's throne. She was the living bond between the two realms, the final chance to heal the great betrayal that had driven humans and bears apart. And she, Margaret, a mere healer's daughter, a girl raised among roots and soil, was meant to guide her. She took a slow, steadying breath. "What must I do?" The green singer raised a hand that was neither hand nor branch nor paw, its fingers weaving patterns in the air that left shimmering trails of green-gold energy. "Step forward, and let the grove see you." Margaret hesitated, glancing back at Thaddeus, who watched silently, his massive form radiating quiet reverence. "Go, young one," the great bear rumbled. "This is why you were chosen." Margaret turned back toward the great tree at the chamber's center, the heartwood. Its bark pulsed as if alive, and the glowing orbs within its branches flickered, mirroring the heartbeat she now felt thrumming through her own skin. She stepped forward, and the world shifted. The truth in the roots. Margaret gasped as visions flooded her mind. She saw the first bears shifting freely between shapes, walking beside humans as equals. She saw the first kings and queens, their bodies fluid like water, learning the old ways from their ursine teachers. She saw the betrayal, how fear had twisted the hearts of men, how a single ruler, driven by arrogance, sought to purge his line of its bare blood, believing it made humans weaker. She saw the wars, the exiles, the destruction of knowledge. She saw the last of the walkers retreating into the shadows, waiting for a time when the bloodlines would reawaken, waiting for her. Her body trembled. Her body trembled. Her bones ached. Her shifting form had been a first step, but it was not enough. She had to let go. Let the past flow through her. Let the old blood remember itself. Margaret closed her eyes and let the grove's song consume her. She was shifting again, but not just her body. Her very essence unraveled and rewove itself, her consciousness expanding until she could feel the heartbeat of the earth beneath her feet, the whisper of the wind against every leaf, the deep, slow breath of the forest that had been waiting for this moment. She was the healer. She was the protector. She was the bridge between two worlds. And Aurora was the key. She opened her eyes, and for the first time, she truly saw. The green singers stood before her, their shifting forms no longer foreign, but familiar. She understood them now. She understood everything. Aurora giggled softly, her pendant blazing with silver-green light. The tree sighed, its ancient branches rustling in a wind that did not blow. The orbs in its branches flared, and in their glow, Margaret saw what was to come. A choice. A final confrontation. Lord Darius would arrive at the grove soon. He would come for Aurora, for the pendant, for the power he did not understand. And he would try to destroy it. She turned back to the green singers, her voice steady, her heart unshaken. "We are ready." Meanwhile, Lord Darius stumbled as the last of Maven's magic collapsed. His soldiers, bloodied and furious, surged through the now unprotected tunnels, their torches casting flickering shadows against the stone. He could feel it, the pulse of power ahead, the grove, the child, the source of everything he had sought to destroy. A dark smile spread across his face. "Burn it all," he ordered. His men hesitated. "My lord, if the green singers are there—" "I don't care," Darius spat. "Do it." The soldiers obeyed, and behind them the corrupted magic howled in delight. The final stand, the grove trembled. The green singers turned as one, their song shifting into something sharp and unyielding. The trees whispered warnings. The wind carried the scent of burning. "They are coming," Thaddeus rumbled. "And they mean to destroy everything." Margaret's blood burned. For the first time she felt no fear. She knelt before Aurora, touching the child's forehead gently. "This is your choice now, little one." Aurora's amber eyes gleamed, filled with the wisdom of generations. She reached up and touched Margaret's cheek, and in that moment the forest roared to life. The final stand at the heart of the grove, Margaret Holden stood in front of Aurora, her body instinctively shifting between forms, no longer resisting the transformation but embracing it. The song of the green singers still echoed through her bones, filling her with a power that was not hers alone, but part of something older, greater, and shared. Across the chamber, Lord Darius loomed, his grotesque half-formed state an abomination of everything the old magic had once been. His body twisted and spasmed, his limbs swelling and shrinking unevenly as he forced his way between human and bear form with dark magic that reeked of suffering. His stolen power did not flow. It shat. The air around him rippled with unraveling energy, a magic that did not belong, forcing nature to break instead of bend. Aurora, cradled in Margaret's arms, did not cry. She watched Darius with an eerie knowing calm, her tiny fingers gripping the pendant that pulsed between them. The green singer's forms flickered, shifting uneasily. They were not warriors. They were the keepers of balance, the memory of what had once been and what could be again. but they could not fight what Darius had become. Margaret realized with sudden, sharp certainty. This fight belonged to her, to Aurora, to those who could still walk the path between. "You were never meant to have this power," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the storm raging around them. "You can't force what was always meant to be shared." Darius laughed, a jagged, guttural sound. "Spare me the sentimental nonsense," he sneered. "Power belongs to those strong enough to take it. The old ways failed because they were weak, because they relied on harmony instead of control." But he stepped forward, and the very ground beneath him withered, grass curling into ash, stone cracking beneath his weight. Thaddeus let out a deep growl, his massive form coiled to strike if needed. But Margaret lifted a hand. No, this wasn't a battle of strength. It was a battle of will, of understanding. Aurora shifted in her arms, her amber eyes gleaming as the light from her pendant flared, pushing back the darkness surrounding Darius. Margaret took a slow breath and let go. She did not fight the transformation.